You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Zabe Bent, Director of Design for the National Association of City Transportation Officials. We chat about how we think too much about the future and growth, the current MUTCD process, and how she would start the design of an infrastructure bill. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting each month. And if you are a Patreon supporter, we just posted bonus materials at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've started doing more bonus materials that enhance the initial episode, so check them out if you're a supporter. And if you're not a Patreon supporter and wish to join our merry band of transportation nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month and you'll get a handwritten note and some stickers. $10 a month and you'll get our bus-only scarf. Appreciate everyone that has supported and continues to support the show. And for a free trial of our 15-year-old Daily Cities newsletter, or for access to our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic Town Planning and Practice, go to theoverheadwire.com. Our newsletter is the oldest and the best in the business because we share information about what everyone else is doing. So check it out if you get a chance, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Zabe Bent, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Jeff.
Well, it's good to finally get you on the show. I know we've talked about this for maybe a couple of years now, possibly. I think it's been a little bit of time.
It feels like it has been that long, yeah.
Well, before we get started, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
My name is Zabe Bent. I am an engineer, a planner, and a designer. And I work at NACTA, which is the National Association of City Transportation Officials, and a mouthful. And I am the director of design.
How did you get into planning, transportation, design, cities? Was it something that happened when you were little, or was it something that you gradually came to as you went through your studies?
I would say it's something that happened when I was little, but I didn't know it then. I didn't know that this was a branch of study or employment or anything that existed. And so I didn't know that this is something that I could do, but I was always the kid who was excited being in the first car of the subway when I was little. I loved walking to the park at the end of the street or what have you. And I remember also having to cross a 6-lane arterial just to go to school as a kid. So I was born in Jamaica. My family is almost entirely from Jamaica. And I remember, how different it was being in one city and then moving as a young child to New York. And so I really had these very different experiences. But I always loved walking and biking and driving and having all of these different things and having all of them relatively close by and having choices. And at first I was like, I want to be an architect. I want to build things. And then I realized architects don't sleep when I got to undergrad. And I was like, this is not what I want to, this is not what I want to do. And so I got into urban planning. And as a planner, I worked originally redeveloping closed, what they called anyway, mental institutions in Massachusetts, and realizing that almost everyone wanted assisted living facilities or senior housing or any number of things. And whenever I would ask why, they would say, because we don't want a lot of traffic. And I was like, surely there is another answer to this. This cannot be the only way forward, and this cannot be the reason. And on a lot of projects that I'd work on, it was always nobody could figure out what to do about the traffic. And so they just said, we're going to pick a use that we think doesn't have as much traffic. And I remember thinking, no, there has to be another way around this. And that's how I got into transportation.
I mean, you'd think that they'd want that use because it was necessary or it was useful in some way, but it was just because of the traffic.
Predominantly because a lot of times they were these massive facilities. And I remember one of them was 500 acres, one of them was 250 acres. And thinking about redeveloping the entire property in a small city or even a mid-sized city or even in Boston, there were people who were just like, we don't want to develop all of this property with, intensive uses because they're in locations where the traffic patterns just wouldn't make sense, would overwhelm the network. It's like, so surely we can design a better network. No, we're not doing that.
Oh, it's such a rough cognitive dissonance of all of that. just from people probably that were asking for less traffic, probably were like, oh, I'm happy to live in my single family neighborhood where built out and create traffic and things like that.
And that's consistent in other projects that I've worked on too over the years.
Right. Well, throughout your work, you've lived in a number of different cities. Are there any standouts, places that you love, even visiting? I mean, I know that you travel a lot. You go to a lot of different places around the world. Is there any place that kind of stands out as a place that you could say that you'd want to live in, or maybe that you'd want to spend an extended amount of time in? Or maybe it's just like a favorite for some random reason.
I don't necessarily have a specific favorite city. I have several favorites, I guess. And I would say that the consistent element is that I can choose how I want to get around. And I still have some confidence I will get there in a reasonable amount of time and not hate it. So yeah, I mean, I love Santiago de Chile. It's been a long time since I've been there, so I can't say how it is now. But I've enjoyed being there. Lisbon consistently remains among my favorite cities. I am one of those New Yorkers who loves New York, but I don't think it's the best city in the world. It just suits me, usually. And I love the size of compact cities. I mean, one of the reasons I like Lisbon is it's a small city that has great transit, and you can still walk around in the city and get where you need to go, but it's close to the beach, and so you can sort of be in other places relatively quickly. And I love that kind of accessibility to city life, but also to nature and to other activities that you get, in the Bay Area, as you know. Or spend a good chunk of time. But yeah, those are the qualities that I like about cities. And I find that any city that's like that, I'm probably going to like it a lot.
Yeah. Other things that you do that I'm always impressed by: metalworking, you do cooking, you also write some science fiction from time to time. How do those likes and interests mix into your transportation, urban planning, profession in general?
I think when we bring our whole selves to our work, we see our work as a person and not just as an expert. And although I've been doing this type of work for so long, remembering to sort of bring my whole self is helpful because it allows me to sort of remember that real people use these facilities that we're designing and building and what have you. And I try to put myself in people like me, as well as sort of seeing the other perspective as I'm planning these projects. The other thing is, I think it's great to have an outlet that isn't your normal everyday, because it allows you to sort of go into subconscious thinking mode and also just have a moment to breathe and sort of recharge and come back. And there were definitely moments when I would go into the jewelry studio and like bang on a piece of metal or melt something because I was so frustrated by what happened in the day. And that really helps to just sort of get out your frustrations, but also it helps to shut your brain off for a bit and come back and sort of rethink, come at something from a different perspective. So I really enjoyed those things. And I think most people would say that my perspective is always putting people first, and remembering all of that really helps to center things like outreach and engagement, or having an actual evaluation framework that results in outcomes rather than just numbers for numbers' sake.
Science fiction is something that you're interested in. I'm wondering if there's any kind of parallels between what futurists talk about and what we're seeing in the built environment, the current time period.
You're going to get me in trouble because I am not a futurist at all. I just don't, even though I am currently writing a novel that centers time travel as the movement device. I think a lot of our urban planning perspectives focus on what's going to happen in the future, and it forces us to think about growth and change. And I think that inherently means that we're going to focus ourselves on not what is happening now. And also when we think about growth, it's often in terms of either the outlier or the sort of the biggest grower, the biggest change, which really doesn't allow us to focus on what's happening to the everyday person or what's happening to the marginalized group or what have you. And so I spent a lot of time, especially recently, trying to say, please, for the love of God, demand is important so that we understand what is happening and sort of can describe it. But I want to focus on need, and that means that we're focusing on what's happening now just as much as the future. But a lot of our planning processes focus on trends and growth and where we're going to. And I'm like, please solve at least one problem that's happening now. Just try. Let's do that.
You always see those models, and I think recently a number of different outlets have posted this as a kind of a commentary on the model. But there's always this undulating travel model or transportation VMT or whatever it is, and then all of the models just say they're all straight up in the air, like it's going to just go up and up forever. And then I think the pandemic kind of maybe changed our mindset for 2 seconds, and then everybody went back to growth again. It seems like maybe we didn't learn something that we should have learned from this last year in terms of the transportation and growth.
Yeah, I think that's true in a lot of ways. And I think part of it is our desire to sort of re-embrace some level of comfort. And for some reason, that means normal. I personally don't find normal or getting back to normal as a comforting thing because normal wasn't working in a lot of different ways for a lot of different people. But I also think that we've changed a lot of things about the way that we do projects, perhaps during the pandemic. And I think the cities that are really going to do well now are cities that are also looking at their systems and our modeling system. I was just at a modeling conference where a lot of people were talking about how models need to change in order to be accepted. Models need to change or evolve in order for people to understand how to use them better. But also we need to change, like we build models, we build the algorithms that go into them. And so we also need to change our thinking about what are the systems that we're using to predict what's happening. And that takes a lot more time. And I'm trying to be patient about that, but it's also incredibly frustrating when it's like, we see that this is not working. I also think that the modelers that are doing interesting things are looking at how to use models not just to answer questions of what will happen in the future, but also to simply change the way we do analysis about our transportation networks.
What does some of that look like? What would that look like if we were to change kind of the way we thought about models generally?
I think looking at how models help us look at geospatial data, again, not just future, but how to compare different scenarios and how we change different inputs. And some of that is certainly about the future and understanding growth and trends and where they're happening. But I think a lot of the scenario analysis could happen now. Like, what if we changed a policy, which could be a today type of thing or a need-based thing? Or what if we understood how people use the network or the system differently based on some model outcomes or model outputs? I think those are some really interesting analyses. And there are a few cities that are doing really interesting work on that front. And again, using the model more as an analysis tool rather than simply a forecasting tool.
And what about the metrics that we use? I mean, I feel like, well, first off, I think that we are way behind in, if I'm thinking from the federal level at least, we're way behind in having goals and setting goals and having actual targets that we're trying to reach. It seems like just a federal kind of, the process is just to dole out money, not necessarily to accomplish anything. I'm wondering how metrics fit into that and like what we're trying to accomplish versus just giving out money.
Yeah, I think we're in an exciting moment where we have an administration that is focused on metrics and has goals that are, at least for me, a little bit more aligned with where I think the organization or administration and the country as a whole could be moving by focusing on equity and safety and sustainability. And so I think it's important to see how these are connected because it creates more transparency in how we make decisions. That transparency creates trust. It also creates, that trust creates stewardship, right? So right now, we see a lot of people sort of carrying projects forward on their own and looking for a champion. But I think a lot of that is that people don't understand how the metrics that we report are connected to the values or goals that we've outlaid. But you make that connection for people and they get why you're tracking this thing. They get where you're making different decisions and they can see the change and hopefully they can align themselves with the projects and hopefully the success of the projects so that they can become champions themselves rather than always looking for a political champion or, quite honestly, an advocate or opponent of a project.
Do you think people are sometimes afraid to set the values and goals because then they feel like they'll have to, back them up?
I don't know. That's never thought about that. I don't know that people are afraid to set them, but I think sometimes, especially if you have been working in government for a while, or if you are an advocate from a marginalized community organization that had been in the trenches fighting for a very long time, and you just haven't seen a lot of change, then you hedge your bets a bit, maybe. And that makes it harder, of course, then to sort of shoot for the moon because you're already not shooting that high or aiming that high. But I also think a lot of our systems are siloed. And so if we only have engineers working towards something, or we only have clean energy, advocates working towards something or what have you, rather than all of these groups working together, they're not getting the full picture. And it makes it really hard to get to successful outcomes. I think the best metrics, the best goals are ones that can tackle multiple items at a time, so that not only are you creating coalition, but you're also seeing how a particular project is impacting more than one element of either your values or your goals or your systems. For example, if we're constantly saying that we only, and I'm just picking out of the air on this one, but if we're only focused on clean energy, then particular policy that doesn't advance mobility or traffic efficiency or performance or road safety is not going to move forward, right? It's not going to have the same access. It's not going to have the same number of folks who are behind it, because they're all focused on clean energy and they don't see the overlap. But if you pick a project and a metric that can show how these two things are connected, you instantly get force multipliers, you get coalition, and you get movement. But I think a lot of times that we're just too siloed.
Is there a way to get out of the silo? I mean, it feels like it's really tough. We had Ben Holland on the show recently from Rock Mountain Institute, and he was talking about kind of how even inside the environmental community, it's hard to have a discussion about land use versus just electric cars and things like that. So it's hard to create those confabs sometimes. And so I'm wondering, how possible is it to kind of create those coalitions and get those projects where you can actually have multiple different people in the room that have different ideas about what the end result might be, but a positive one?
I think it's just talking to people.
Is it really that
I know
easy?
It sounds crazy. It's not, obviously. But I definitely feel like a lot of times we get entrenched in our thinking that this is the answer. And I think a lot of the way that we are taught to approach situations is to find the solution, which makes us feel like there's only one thing. And I feel like I say this all the time, but there are no hero modes. There are no silver bullets. There isn't usually one answer. Urban transportation or urban mobility is a multi-headed beast, and we kind of have to chip away at each piece of it. We can't, just chop off one thing. And so I think talking to people who do work outside of our norm, that's got to be the way forward. I mean, we're seeing right now a public health crisis that played out on urban streets, right? We're literally trying to figure out how do we reconfigure our streets to make sure that we can fit public health norms that are changing. That's then touching on public space. And then now we're talking about how do you allocate public space? Well, that's an equity consideration. We have to think of that in both the current and the historical context. And now we've got, this sort of justice framework, and it becomes this bigger and bigger thing. But space also touches on mobility, it touches on equity, and it touches on sustainability. And it's happening again now, as opposed to sort of long-reaching environmental things like climate change, which is a real thing, but is happening in the future for a lot of people who obviously can't see the hurricane schedule or all the wildfires or what have you. But the things that we would do to protect the climate and the things that we would do to protect space are essentially the same. So if we align all of those different groups, I think we can make a much bigger and more immediate dent in something that is both happening now and in the future.
There was a really interesting piece I think it was yesterday in Next City, talking about, the freeway teardowns and the connecting places, the other spot that got disconnected from across the freeway. But the author, and I feel bad because I can't remember her name right now, but I'll put it in the show notes, and it's in my newsletter as well. And what she said is that not just freeway teardowns, but maybe pavement as well, like just generally, because there's so many things that pavement kind of means to environmental quality, to environmental justice, all of that impervious cover that is part of just paving over spaces. And I thought that was really interesting because it's kind of a different perspective. I've seen so many pieces lately, I think maybe just because of the discussion of it at the federal level for some of that funding that might go to, reconnecting neighborhoods like Rondo in St. Paul. But there's that discussion. But then some of this other discussions like the heat island effect and everything else that happens because of climate change It's really interesting to see kind of that different perspective. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that, because it kind of deconstructs that structure of a highway that's built out of concrete, obviously, to the idea of pavement generally. And I just thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really helpful framing, because I do think, and I was just talking about it on a panel earlier this week, but I do feel like we forget how much we have done to sort of create pristine spaces in urban environments, and to say this is a separate space for this and this is a separate space for that. And there's certainly a place for that, but not every space can be that. And we're people, and in order to have, realistic human, people scale places, we do want to touch, greenery, and we want to touch water and air and what have you. And we need spaces that can bring all of those things together. Then it will help, again, connection, as well as, long-term and short-term needs for sustainability. Yeah, I mean, the freeway teardowns is a bigger issue, I think, because I think in a lot of cases, tearing them down is probably the right answer, but I don't think that's true in every case. And I don't know that anyone's actually saying we should tear down all freeways.
No,
but I hope not anyway. But I do think it's important to figure out, how do we repair the harm? And also, how do we do that based on what we have in front of us today? And how are we bringing other people into that discussion? And again, I think a lot of people will approach a situation, and particularly in urban mobility, because everyone thinks they know the answer, but also, there are other answers available. But I think a lot of times people will say, well, I want a stop sign, at the end of my street. And then you actually ask them what the problem is, and they sort of go a level deeper. And it's like, oh, you want traffic calming, and you want a little bit more placemaking, you want people to slow down, and that sort of, okay, well, here are the other options that we have. Stop sign isn't really what you want. But if we get really focused on the stop sign, like tearing down a freeway, rather than having a discussion about what we really need and what we want based on what's there now, I think we'll end up in a very different place. So yeah, I think it's a great conversation to be having, and I love the idea of thinking about it broader and bringing in these sort of bigger issues. Because essentially freeways divided people, but they also cut people off from nature, right? Like they divided communities, they cut communities like mine, off from economic activity, from upward mobility, from green spaces, from connection with each other, with other communities, all those things. So yeah, it has to be a bigger solution than just let's tear down a freeway.
You mentioned stop signs. That brings me to thinking about the MUTCD and kind of the discussion that's going on there. What's the current situation with what's going on with the kind of the pushback against the MUTCD and reforming it as a whole?
Yeah. So this is the first time it's being revisited at this scale in, I think, 11 or 12 years. And the last time that it was undertaken, comments were open, and I think they received something like 2,600 comments, and this time around they received 26,000. And so there's a lot of work to be done there to understand what everyone's saying and thinking about and doing. And so I think it'll take some time. But the idea at this point is to really look at the document and say, is it accomplishing what it was meant to accomplish? And what is the right way to respond to the combined crisis of traffic safety, road safety, of racial justice and equity, and our climate crisis? And make sure that we actually come out with a document that doesn't just say this is where to put a stop sign or what have you, but actually a document that enables the types of roadway configurations that we actually need, types of projects that we actually need, and encourages us to make the right decision for, and when I say us, I mean engineers, because this is a document that is essentially used exclusively by engineers, but encourages us to make the right decision for our vision of urban mobility in particular, but of mobility across the nation. Right now, we have a document that makes it possible for you to think that you could want to make the right decision. And I mean that generously. And what we need is a document that says, here is the easiest way to make the right decision. It's going to take some time to get there, though, because it's a huge undertaking. I think the draft was 700 and some odd pages. And we're at a point now where, unfortunately, and this is another issue of access, but unfortunately, they are sort of going off on their own and reviewing the comments behind closed doors, because that's sort of what a process looks like. But that does mean that we don't all get to be a part of how does this document get written? How do you incorporate comments on a 700-page document where there are comments on almost every page?
It made me think of, what is it in UK Parliament? It's like the House of Lords or whatever, where they all argue with each other. You know, I feel like there needs to be maybe a virtual room where there's a whole bunch of people arguing with each other, maybe over.
I mean, we were hoping that there would be some sort of like round table discussions or, listening sessions or something. And they did have some of that. But what's going to happen now is that, they're going to go off and write this document.
But some of them felt accosted by the number of comments that were received. I felt like there were some that felt personally, like there was a personal affront to them that the document was being questioned, which was interesting to me.
I cannot really comment on that simply because
I'll comment on it.
No, I mean, it's more like that's not something that I can quite understand, because maybe as a writer or just as, a person in this world, I don't know, but I'm used to hearing people say, what the heck is that thing? And, how do we make it better? Or what have you? And you say, okay, fine, it's not working. Okay. But you take a breather, and then you come back and you're like, okay, how do I fix this? But also, this is something that's been around since 1970. The current iteration has been around since 1970 something. So I get it. It's sort of your Bible.
I think that's how we met. I was yelling about the Geary subway or
that's
something.
That's right. You were.
Back in 2010 or somewhere.
You wanted the Geary subway.
Yeah, that's right.
And I didn't disagree. I just said we could probably get BRT sooner.
Yes.
Different discussion. Yeah. I know. We're not going there.
Recent events aside.
Exactly.
Yeah, the manual. Are there any ways that you've seen that the manual has stymied good decisions, like particular instances where you've seen something that might have been different if there was another approach?
I think the easiest and most relatable thing is signal warrants, which is something that comes in pretty much every city that I've ever worked in, where in order to get a traffic signal with a pedestrian crossing, you need to prove that there's a certain amount of demand for pedestrian crossings.
Yeah.
And literally, I've heard people say, there is a senior center on this side of the street. It's, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 traffic lanes to cross. Traffic flows freely, and the next intersection is, a 5-minute walk away. Oh, but there isn't enough pedestrian demand there, so the signal is not warranted. That's sort of like, if there were a bridge across this river, then we would be able to cross. But since there's no bridge across this river, we can't cross it. And it's like, well, do you want to cross the river or not? That's the real question, right? Like, it's sort of like if you build it, they will come, works for cars, but it works for other modes too. And so you can't measure demand that you haven't created an outlet for. But the other thing that's really worrying about that is even if people have died at that location, trying to cross the street, trying to create that demand or satisfy that number, you still have to wait until 4 more have died before you can build it there, because it's not warranted until 5 people have died there. And obviously, that's a little bit insane to think about. Like, how did that number become the number? How did even, 150 people become the number for a demand, much less five deaths? And I think that is the easiest things, that the idea is to maintain traffic flow, to reduce delay, to reduce vehicle congestion. But this is a document that was based on creating safety and clarity on our urban streets and making sure that everyone could recognize a traffic signal. Everyone could recognize what a stop sign looks like. Everyone knew what the rules of the road were and how to design for them. And our system has changed a lot, but also we understand more about the way people need to interact. And the document needs to change to reflect that.
Yeah, I was reading another piece that you were quoted in, and it was talking about the MUTCD and how, basically you were saying that it's been created for cars and about cars, and everything is related to cars, and then everything else is othered. People walking, people cycling, people on mobility devices. Anything else is just like, well, you're not a car, you aren't a part of the club.
Yeah, I mean, sort of if we had a food pyramid and levels 1, 2, 3, and 4 were car, and then at the bottom was everything else, and it's like teeny tiny pyramids. And that's essentially how it feels when going through the document. And I think there's a way to do it that is mode agnostic, probably. I think that would take a lot more effort and time than maybe we have right now. But I think that the main thing is to simply say, if we want to have safer streets, if we want to have equitable networks, if we want to have sustainable outcomes and meet all the crises that we're facing right now, then we need to make sure that at the very least, all users are on the same footing. But the best way forward is probably to elevate the most vulnerable users, to make sure that the modes of travel that we know to be most sustainable or most vulnerable are prioritized. And right now, we're not doing that.
Right now, the American Jobs Plan / Bipartisan Plan / Invest Act / Everything in the World Act is going through Congress in terms of transportation and infrastructure. If you had the opportunity to start from scratch on creating a bill, how would you start it out?
Wow. An infrastructure bill?
Yeah.
Specifically? I feel like I have to be careful what I say because Beth Osborne is going to come after me. It's not the right thing. Which is great. But if I were going to create an infrastructure bill, I would figure out what are the types of infrastructure we need to make sure that everyone who resides, works, lives in our communities has access to work, to play, to food, to healthcare, to school by a sustainable mode. Whatever we need to do in order to make that happen. And I know that seems really sort of like pie in the sky, but I think if you put that sort of forward and you center that notion, then it means that people should be able to walk to school. People should be able to take their kids to school without having to get in their car, because obviously that's creating traffic congestion. But people should be able to get to work. People should be able to go to the hospital in a reasonable amount of time, and that cannot be done if folks are stuck in traffic. I think we need to make sure that any infrastructure we're building is not single use, which is what we have now when we build highways and roads for cars. Those are single use facilities. We cannot continue to build those. So I think we need to make sure that we are building for multiple modes at a time and that we're putting the efficiency and connectivity of those sustainable modes first. So that's like how I would approach the problem. And in order to do that, I think we need to make sure that we are connecting basically pedestrian, bicycle, and transit routes that simply have not had investment in decades. And that means infill projects. That means, projects that are repurposing existing facilities and sort of redistributing both the space and the time and the budget that we are spending on those sustainable modes. We shouldn't be building new roads for, cars to drive on. We should be building new connections for walking and biking and transit. We should be repurposing those facilities. I also think, and this is sort of less infrastructure based, but I think we need to make sure that those are facilities that have sort of policy underpinnings that support them. So, I think we need to look at our commuter benefits package, especially in the last year. We've seen that a lot of people, at least office workers, don't have to commute, but they need other infrastructure improvements in order to make that work. Like how many people paid extra for their Wi-Fi connection so that they can have faster, speedier connections out of their own pocket, or came out of a company pocket or something like that. Maybe we don't need parking subsidies. Maybe we need internet subsidies, those sorts of things. So I think we need to think about how they're all connected to each other. And I think we need to build more green infrastructure. Like literally, we separate our roadways from our greenways. And I would love to see more of that incorporated. I'd love to see, like a bus stop with a green shelter. How do we actually make sure that we're incorporating more greenery into our spaces? But I think infrastructure is like, what is the backbone of how we get around, how we make connections? And I think it has to be more about getting to work. I think it has to be about getting to school, getting to the hospital, getting to all these different things by sustainable modes.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, Emily Badger's kind of been on a roll lately with some of her pieces in New York Times. She had one a couple of weeks ago about the flattening of rush hour and had that discussion. Then yesterday was one about the kind of hollowing out of downtowns and the changing, needs of urban spaces that we've now kind of ceded to offices from where they used to be warehousing and everything else. And that kind of speaks to your discussion as well. I mean, I think that ultimately we need to think about how people get to work and whether they actually need, express buses versus the internet connection. Like you said, it seems like there's going to be a flattening out. Maybe. I mean, who knows what's going to actually happen? I mean, I've said many times on this show that I don't like to make the predictions, but we like to talk about it. But there's maybe a flattening out. And then what does that mean for, transportation services more generally? Like if we do flatten the rush hour, does that mean we can spend money more equitably? And what does that actually mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have seen with the pandemic, we've seen people traveling at different times of day than we would normally see, or peaks at least at different times of day, and a much, much smaller peak in many cases. But, San Francisco, for example, has changed its bus network, I think 4 times in the past year or so. And that has been to respond to when and where frontline workers are trying to get to work. And many of our transit systems are very much focused on commute hours and very much focused on downtown hub and spoke systems. And that's not how people who are going to, from home in, the Bayview to, their job at SF General or to wherever it might be. It's just a very different travel pattern by time of day and by location. And I think when we see bus networks and bike networks and scooter systems and bike share systems, all these different things are changing. Previously, those trips were dedicated to people in cars because the transit network couldn't really shift that way because it's just not built that way. But I think more and more our networks need to respond to that need. We need to see all day networks, and we need to see people traveling to the locations that they currently need to get to. We need more ring systems. That only works if we realize that, the office worker is the most flexible worker now, not the least. But our systems are pretty much tailored to them right now.
Yeah, it's kind of weird to think about that. And we've done it for so long that maybe we can't see a different outcome than maybe the one that we've been so used to. I think we're creatures of habit and inertia, and sometimes it's hard to get out of that.
Absolutely. We want people to go back to normal, and that's the normal that wasn't working for all of those workers who took, 2 hours to get to work. Right. What would our systems look like if we designed it so that they could get to work in, 30 minutes, 15 minutes?
Well, it didn't really work for transit agencies either. I think they're spending a strange amount of money on these commute patterns where they had bus, layovers after rush and, during the morning and then afternoon. And then you had, drivers that maybe weren't doing something in the middle of the day, or they had to come back and they had a different shift or whatever that might be. So it was kind of just weird. And the focus on that maybe, 10% of time for 19% of the travel, the trips, it's just a weird construct. And the idea that everybody's traveling at the same time every single day is weird. It reminds me of one of those like silly, old 1950s British films where they're trying to show you the city and like they have this like Art Deco drawings, and Bob gets into his car and drives to work, and there's like the factory with the smokestack and all. I don't know. Anyways, like
I mean, I totally see those sort of things, and even the Jetsons. We have this sort of very much focused on, okay, now everyone's going to work, and
right.
These hovercraft or what have you. Yeah, I mean, we've assumed that is normal. But if we don't start serving other types of trips at other types of day, then the idea of car shedding will never become real. You can't shed your car if you've got to take your kid to school, at 7 or 8, and then you have to go somewhere else. And those trips are completely, at odds from each other. Or, you've got to go to work at a bar or a restaurant at, 11 at night, and you don't have a transit option at that hour, or it takes you 3 hours to get home, all of those things. We need networks that respond to those needs.
What's been exciting to you lately in terms of transportation, cities generally? Is there anything that's like, getting you very excited for the future or maybe for the present?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed seeing how cities are pivoting from what they've learned during the pandemic. And we have little people in the background, hopefully.
That's
We'll
That's
see
how
how
it
that
goes.
goes, but that's also part of new normal, in my opinion.
You know what? I didn't even notice. I mean, I noticed it, but I was like, oh, okay, cool, kids.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's been really interesting and exciting to see how cities are learning from the work that they're doing right now, and not just, how to put down a better, faster bike lane or extend a curb or sidewalk or what have you, but how to use space differently and how to deliver it faster, how to sort of integrate the work that they're doing with something else someone else is doing, and asking questions about how to engage with people differently, how to redistribute investment so that we're addressing, historical wrongs or simply trying to create a better present and future. All of those are, even just the question is exciting to me. I, of course, want a lot more than that. And, the cities that I think are really trying to grapple with these questions and change the way that they work, not just, putting down different projects is one thing. Thinking about how to deliver those projects differently is what I find most exciting right now.
It's interesting to read pieces about how those are being implemented as well, some of the open streets and some of the things that have been kind of reconfigured, but also some of the negatives that come. I mean, we often see it as a really big positive thing, but there's been a couple of articles recently in Eater, and even I think in maybe it was Bloomberg or maybe it was Fast Company, can't remember, but a couple about people who are disabled and they have problems getting through the mall that is, the pop-up restaurant. And so it's interesting to kind of take a different perspective and look at the things that there's a benefit to these changes and creating access for people, but then maybe it takes away access from other people who might need it even more.
I think it doesn't have to be that way. I'm going to be honest about that. I think it's good that we're hearing from those perspectives that are saying, good God, you've done this wrong, or hey, you forgot about this very obvious thing, or obvious to me. And I think it's one of the ways that it shows that it really is important to hear from multiple voices. But I also think in our efforts to move very quickly, sometimes we sort of do a new thing in an old way and forget about, all these other things that we might have learned. And in some ways, I give cities a lot of credit for that, because cities have, city employees have been going through a pandemic too, right? They're trying to do all these things in the midst of trying to figure out, what does our work crew look like, not just now in general going forward, but now today, because, Sam called in sick because of COVID or, what have you. And so I think it's important to recognize that the people who are doing this work are also people who've been going through a pandemic. But I also think there are some things that are really just crazy to see on our streets. And I think we're going to have to reckon with them going forward and think, okay, now that we're not in response mode and we're not just putting down something out of nowhere, how do we move forward? How do we not just say, okay, well, this is what we're doing today because it's new and we have to do something, but how do we learn from what we've done and sort of figure out what's the right way to do it going forward, or what's a better way, I should say, to do it going forward? What did we learn here? And that, I mean, I can see it's frustrating, but it's also exciting. And quite honestly, I'm horrified when anytime someone puts up a pop-up restaurant across a sidewalk or bike lane. I'm just like, you're cutting off access. Like, that's pretty obvious. Like, yeah, I'm like, that's 2 feet wide. Nobody can get through that, much less someone in a wheelchair. What are you thinking?
Right.
But sometimes we're just trying to get it on the ground.
You had a quote in the Washington Post that I thought was really apt. Our streets are physical manifestations of our policy and our funding choices. I just thought that was really appropriate and a wonderful way to kind of like connect everything together.
Yeah, this is one of those moments where this is just how my brain is wired. But you put your money where your mouth is, right? If we say we care about one thing and we build something entirely different, then it makes people wonder if we really care about that. But I think a lot of times as engineers, we tend to say, this is the solution based on the way that I was taught. And we kind of forget that the end user is an actual person, and forget how it sort of sits in the environment that it's designed for. So yeah, it's one of the reasons that I think we should care so much about evaluation frameworks and metrics and outcomes and how we tell the story of a project. But what we decide to build and how we decide to build it is absolutely a manifestation of our values and our policy and our financial decisions.
Does that connect to something that we traded messages about in terms of equity as well? I mean, I think that, there's a lot of discussion about equity, but oftentimes it goes to discussion about just outreach, but not necessarily the structures and the processes that put together that equitable outcome?
Yeah, a lot of times we work with cities that are trying to figure out the way to do equitable engagement and to do outreach in communities that they might not typically hear from. And sometimes they say, they don't come to our meetings, or, we only had a few people show up, or what have you. And I've been on the other end of that. Certainly every time I had a public workshop, I would say, please come to my party. For the love of God, I don't want to be alone at my party. So I get it. I really do. I've been there. But I think if we focus too much on engagement as the equity and sort of leaving the decision making to folks, once we've already, designed our project or our policy, that is absolutely not the same as demonstrating how the project or the policy or the outcomes or the metrics are tied to things that people care about. And so if we can change our actual evaluation metrics in our analysis tools to be more equitable and to lead to more equitable outcomes, then people are going to engage with us because they see that we actually care. And it's a really different framing. It's the difference between, sort of saying, do you want vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream? Or, do we want to have a conversation about ice cream or, cake, right? Those are really different questions. And I think in order for us to get to a place that makes more sense, we not only need to redistribute the wealth and build different projects, but we need to incorporate different voices in how we get there. And make sure that it's not, at the end game, but actually demonstrate to people, this is how we are using your feedback. This is how the project changed. This is how our policies changed as a result of your feedback. Otherwise, why would I come to your meeting either? I don't believe I'm just going to talk at you and you're not going to do what I'm thinking, or you're not going to react to what I'm thinking. And people get that and they see that. So if there's no trust, they won't come.
What are you working on now?
So many things. So I'm working on an update to the Urban Bikeway Guide, which we absolutely want to make sure to update and refresh the design guidance that's there for bikeways and cycling, but we also want to make sure that that is touching on shared micromobility in a way that it hasn't really before. We want to sort of figure out what new things our city's doing when it comes to cycling infrastructure and how we can learn from all the different ways that the pandemic has changed the way that people move around cities, hopefully shift towards more integrated work in that regard. Not just what to build, but how to build it, how to deliver it. I'm working on also some federal policy stuff, still trying to figure out what's going to happen with the MUTCD. And sort of trying to advocate for, again, more engaging and more proactive solutions there. We're looking at ways to take our policy discussions about setting speed limits from a safe systems approach rather than from a what does the driver want approach.
Right, 85% rule.
Yeah, which is basically the 85 percentile rule. We're looking at ways to figure out how to incorporate that into our training, how to incorporate it into our platforms, policy platforms, so that folks have sort of resources if they want to pursue this on their own. And there are many cities that are already looking at this and how to do that. But we're also looking at what are the mechanisms that cities are using and looking at enforcement and trying to figure out how do you come to a more equitable and connected enforcement pattern. Right now, there isn't a whole lot of data that shows that our current enforcement of basically ticketing is having a true impact on road safety. And so we want to make sure that if there is enforcement, that it is actually connected to road safety. It should not be used as a tool for pretextual traffic stops or revenue generation or all of the other things that people believe that it's really about. Obviously, the first call is figuring out, what are the design solutions, the sort of lasting solutions that we can implement to get to more self-enforcing projects and design. But then the other thing is just understanding what are the policy levers that need to be in place there and what are some alternatives to that.
You could put just a big tree in the middle of every road. That would slow people down, right?
I mean, that's a traffic circle. There are plenty of cities that are doing that, and it's effective in a lot of situations. Sadly, it's not effective in many other situations. I wish there were more trees in pretty much every city. Yeah. But yeah, we've got to come up with other situations. I personally don't think that necessarily means that a human being with a gun should be pulling people over. But there are other solutions there. So having a broader conversation about that, I think, would be really helpful.
Yeah.
And I'm working on a novel.
Nice.
Yeah, those are my things.
So this is the novel about time travel? It's a part of it anyways.
It's part of the sort of device. This person is trying to figure out, how to move through her own life. And apparently, I did not know this, and I almost don't want to say this because hopefully no one will jump the gun, but apparently there aren't that many novels centering time travel that are also centering women. I think there is one. Or maybe not movies. I don't want to misspeak here because I feel like someone must have done this. But yeah, it'll be how do you move through life, basically. That's my short answer.
Nice.
We'll see. I'm almost done, so folks will hopefully read it soon. Fingers crossed. Someone's going to pick it up.
Looking forward to it. Where can folks find you online if you wish to be found?
I am on, I think, all social media platforms at Zabe Bent, Zabebent, one word. Yeah, and at NACDO and in the interwebs in the world.
Nice. Well, Zabe, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.